Hello everyone, this is Medical Gateway, and today we're going to start a new chapter, which is chapter number 34 of Guyton, which is resistance of the body to infections, leukocyte, granulocyte, monocyte, macrophage system, and inflammation. Basically, we're going to discuss WBCs in this chapter. So let's start WBCs, white blood cells. Okay, so there are two types of white blood cells in the blood, which are granulocytes and agranulocytes. So granulocytes include neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. So neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils are granulocytes. They are said to be granulocytes because their appearance is granular. If you focus, they look like granular appearance. Okay, and then we have agranulocytes. Agranulocytes include monocytes and lymphocytes. Their appearance is not granular, so that's why they are agranulocytes. So granulocytes include neutrophil, eosinophil, and basophil, and agranulocytes include monocytes and lymphocytes. Now coming to their relative percentages. So the most common type of white blood cells is neutrophils, which is 62%. And after the neutrophils, we have lymphocytes, which are 30%. So neutrophils and lymphocytes collectively form 92% of the white blood cells. Okay, so 62% neutrophils and 30% lymphocytes. And then we have monocytes, which are 5.3%, and then eosinophils, which are 2.3%, and at the last we have the lowest quantity of basophils, which is 0.4%. Okay, now coming to their functions. Now, neutrophils and monocytes. Now, basically, what is the main function of white blood cells? The function of the white blood cells is immunity related. White blood cells provide immunity to the body. Whenever there is a foreign invader, the white blood cells will come and they will eat the foreign invader or activate different mechanisms by which the body is able to fight the foreign invaders like viruses and bacteria. Okay? Now regarding the eating up of the foreign bodies, there are, out of these 5 types of white blood cells, neutrophils and monocytes are basically involved in the phagocytosis. So neutrophils and monocytes are involved in the phagocytosis. Okay? Whereas coming to the lymphocytes, there are 2 types of lymphocytes, B cells and T cells, T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. Now, they also kill the foreign invaders, but the mechanism is a little bit different. B cells are converted into the plasma cells, and then plasma cells are converted into the antibodies. And then antibodies attack the foreign invaders by multiple different actions, which we will discuss in the coming chapter. Then we have T cells, T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes kill the foreign invaders by releasing cytotoxins. So neutrophils kill by phagocytosis, monocytes also kill by phagocytosis, T lymphocytes kill by cytotoxins, and B cells kill by antibodies production. Okay? Or neutralize the foreign invaders by antibody production. There are 5 to 7 different mechanisms by which antibodies act. We'll discuss all of them in the coming chapter. Then we have eosinophils and basophils. Now, if you see eosinophils and basophils, they are in relatively lesser quantity as compared to the other types of white blood cells. Now, both of these eosinophils or basophils are basically involved in the allergic reactions. Both the eosinophils and basophils are involved in the allergic reactions. Okay? Now, basophils basically release histamine. Now, histamine will further cause inflammation, will cause vasodilation, and a lot of things in the allergies. The topic of the eosinophils and basophils will be discussed in detail in after 2 to 3 parts. Okay, then we have eosinophils. As basophils are causing the allergic reactions by releasing histamine, which is causing vasodilation, and many other things. Eosinophils have basically immunomodulatory function. So the function is basically modulation of inflammatory response. So basophils are causing inflammation in the allergic reactions, whereas eosinophils are keeping a check on that inflammation by modulation of inflammatory response. Then another function of the eosinophils is that they have anti-parasitic function. I'm sorry. So then, from where are these cells produced? All of these cells are basically produced from bone marrow. So produced from bone marrow, and here is also bone marrow. So neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and monocytes all are produced from bone marrow, whereas lymphocytes are produced from lymphogenous tissues. So after being produced, all of them go from bone marrow into the blood, and from blood they enter the tissues. So neutrophils go into blood and then enter tissues, whereas eosinophils, basophils, and monocytes also go from bone marrow directly into the blood and then into the tissues. Whereas lymphocytes are produced from lymphogenous tissues. So what are the lymphogenous tissues? They all are the tissues which are involved with the lymphatic system. The tissues like lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, they all are lymphogenous tissues. So they all are lymphogenous tissues. So as they are involved with the lymphatic system, the lymphocytes, when produced by the lymphogenous tissues, are first released into the lymph. They are not directly entered into the blood. First, they are released into the lymph. From lymph, they go into the blood, and from blood, they go into the tissues. And then from tissues, they go back into the lymph and are recycled. Okay? So neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and monocytes all are having the same pathway. They are produced by bone marrow, released into the blood, then they go to the tissues. Lymphocytes are a little bit different. They are not produced in bone marrow. They are produced in lymphogenous tissues, released not directly into the blood. First, they're released into the lymph, from where they go into the blood, and from blood they go into the tissues. Okay? Now, regarding the time that when they are released, up to how many hours these all will stay into blood before moving into the tissues. So neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils have the same timings. Neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, all of them remain in blood for 4 to 8 hours before they move into the tissues, where they stay for 4 to 5 days. So these three have the same timings. The granulocytes behave the same. They all are produced by bone marrow. They all go into the blood. They all stay in blood for 4 to 8 hours, and then they go into the tissues, where they stay for 4 to 5 days. Whereas monocytes, which is an agranulocyte, they are produced from bone marrow, but they will stay in blood way more than 4 to 8 hours. They will stay in blood for 10 to 20 hours. And when they go to the tissues, they are converted into tissue macrophages and stay there for months. The granulocytes stay in the tissues for 4 to 5 days, whereas the monocytes, when they go from blood into the tissues, they are converted into the tissue macrophages, where they stay for months. Okay? Whereas the lymphocytes, they go from lymph to blood and then finally to the tissues. They stay in the tissues for weeks to months. So both the agranulocytes stay in the tissues for months, whereas the granulocytes stay in the tissues for a few days, 4 to 5 days. Okay? So these were the types of the WBCs. Now, if you have to remember, it's very easy to remember. 2 of them do phagocytosis, neutrophils and monocytes. 2 of them are involved in the allergy, eosinophils and basophils. And then lymphocytes have their own 2 types, T cells and B cells. T cells killed by cytotoxin, and B cells killed by formation of the antibodies. Granulocytes are produced by bone marrow, go in blood, and then finally into the tissues. And they stay for a relatively lesser time in the blood and the tissues as compared to the agranulocytes. A very important point is that monocytes, on arrival in the tissues, they become tissue macrophages. Okay? So neutrophils and monocytes are both macrophages, but the interesting point is that neutrophils can do phagocytosis both in blood as well as the tissues, whereas the monocytes basically are converted into tissue macrophages, so they can do phagocytosis only in the tissues. Okay? So this was regarding the types of the WBCs. Very important lecture. See you in next part.